Hello, I'm Peter Gallagher, and this is Page to Screen. Most horror stories prey on our worst fears. The Silence of the Lambs takes you into the darkest recesses of the human mind. Although some of the characters are bizarre, others, like Dr. Hannibal Lecter, are horrifying because they seem so normal. It doesn't always happen like this, but the story behind The Silence of the Lambs, beginning with a reclusive author, Thomas Harris, and ending in career-defining roles for Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster, is as interesting as the fictional tale itself.
He won't come after me.
He dug the graves up of elderly women.
Walker.
It's a story of madmen whose twisted minds mingled sex with violence.
Hey, you don't know what pain is!
The FBI never uses the term serial killers. They call sexual homicide.
These crimes obsessed a reclusive author.
The soul of a man who writes about this kind of terror is a dark soul.
A dark soul who created the most terrifying villain of our time.
He had just plugged into something truly horrifying.
It was a literary vision some felt too grisly for the screen.
It was too violent.
But it gave one woman a chance to put the past behind her.
I really wanted to put an end to playing victims.
What does he do, this man you seek?
He kills women.
It offered one man who'd given up thoughts of stardom a chance to dream again.
Go now!
Expectations for the film were low.
There wasn't a reason to think, there it is, the next big thing.
But The Silence of the Lambs wound up grossing nearly $300 million, and it swept the Oscars like no film in almost 20 years. In the next hour, we'll see how one author's bone-chilling book was created and then transformed by a band of outsiders into a cinematic thriller for the ages. When The Silence of the Lambs was published in 1988, it took readers on a nightmarish ride into the darkest recesses of human behavior. In The Silence of the Lambs, FBI trainee Clarice Starling races to rescue a kidnapped young woman from a serial killer named Buffalo Bill. Desperate to find her before she's murdered, Starling seeks help from an unlikely source, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. A brilliant former psychiatrist imprisoned for his crimes of cannibalism, he agrees to help her find Buffalo Bill on one condition. She must reveal her innermost secrets first. Who would dream of a world where young women are slain and stripped of their skin, where tongues are torn out by the teeth of a madman? Strangely enough, a quiet Southern gentleman would, and he did it after researching real-life murderers in our midst. Born in 1940, Thomas Harris grew up in Mississippi. He started out as an English major at Baylor University in Texas, and then wrote for the Associated Press in New York during the 70s. But why he became fascinated with the grisly subject of serial murder is unknown, since the reclusive author has refused all media requests for the past 20 years.
He's very quiet. He doesn't really talk about his work much. He's very private about his work. You don't ever see the dark side there that you might expect to see from someone with this kind of imagination.
The soul of a man who writes about this kind of terror is a dark soul. Tom told me that these characters were in him. I mean, he wasn't obviously those characters, a more mild-mannered human being you'd never meet. But somewhere in him, these characters lived, and it meant that he had to face them every day. He had to come into contact with them every day, and he didn't like it. And I thought that that was extremely interesting.
To bring these characters to life, Harris quit journalism in 1975 and began a long period of arduous research.
What sets him apart from other, not only other thriller writers, but from many other, even writers who are just storytellers or of any genre, is his attention to detail.
When he writes about guns, he knows. He goes to gun shows and knows what's going on with guns. If he writes about a forensic procedure, he's probably stood in a room when someone's performed it. He's really exhaustive in his research.
Harris's work culminated in Red Dragon, the book that first introduced Hannibal Lecter in 1981. A peripheral character then, he next took center stage in The Silence of the Lambs, Harris's follow-up, a book which took the author over 6 years to complete.
Well, he's a meticulous researcher, and he's, for that reason, a slow writer. He doesn't want to fake his way through anything.
Commenting on why it was taking such time, he said, "I can't write it until I believe it." And when you consider that he was talking about The Silence of the Lambs, yeah, I got goosebumps up and down my arm.
The Silence of the Lambs was published in 1988 to great critical acclaim. Now fully fleshed out, Hannibal Lecter took hold of readers like the teeth-crammed mouth of a pit bull on its favorite bone.
As a villain, he's completely successful because you feel for him, you know? You want him to get away, even though you know he's an absolute terror menace to society. Not a person that you'd ever want to run into, but at the same time, you really admire him in a way. You kind of admire how smart he is.
And so that's the other great genius of Tom Harris, is to create this character that you're simultaneously attracted to on some level and repelled by. And I think it's the greatest villain in popular fiction in decades.
But the book owed its success to more than the character of Hannibal Lecter. The writing of Thomas Harris made his book different from other suspense novels.
He's marvelous at constructing a suspenseful story.
Skin. She knew who had her then. The knowledge fell on her like every scalding thing on earth, and she was screaming, screaming.
He's very, very good at characterization. You know, the people become vivid.
Her fears breathed on her from close behind her neck. Other recent memories squirmed beside her.
The more you care about the person and the greater the threat, the greater the thriller, the more powerful the suspense.
He has a near-perfect ear for dialogue. The dialogue is so on the nose.
Did you do all the drawings on your walls, Doctor? Did you do it from memory, all the details? Memory, Officer Starling, is what I have instead of a view.
This guy is not a Robert Ludlum or a Jim Patterson or a more traditional suspense writer, which is not to put them down by any means, because they're very good at what they do. But Tom is different. He threw out the rule that the most interesting villain was the guy who's committing the murders.
Harris's story placed the most memorable villain, Hannibal Lecter, in jail. His secondary villain, Buffalo Bill, was on the loose. While Lecter came largely from the author's imagination, Buffalo Bill was a composite of 3 real-life murderers Harris learned about from John Douglas, a pioneer in deciphering the psychology of serial killers.
Harris observed me giving lectures at the FBI Academy where I spoke about the Ed Gein case and the Ted Bundy case and the Gary Heidney case.
Buffalo Bill abducts his female victims in order to make a suit of their flesh.
Oh, good. Good.
This aspect of his behavior is based on the man who also inspired the character of Norman Bates in Psycho, Ed Gein.
Ed Gein dug the graves up of elderly women after his mother died, and he would put them in a pig shed and basically strung them up like you would a deer and gutted them out. And around the house he had lampshades made of skin. He was into transvesticism, cross-dressing. He'd put a dress on and put the face of the victim on and then look into the mirror.
Most of Bill's twisted psychology is drawn from Ed Gein, but other aspects of his behavior came from Ted Bundy, whose killing spree took the lives of over 20 young women in the 1970s.
Ted Bundy would actually wear a phony cast on his arm, wait outside of a library for his preferential victim.
Can I help you with that?
Would you?
Sure.
She was struck in the head with the cast, rendered unconscious, cuffed, and pushed down on the floorboard. And then he would take the victim away and spend hours, days with him.
Where Buffalo Bill kept his victims was based on yet another murderer, Gary Heidnik. His victims met their deaths in the basement of Heidnik's house.
And he began to dig a pit. It was about 5 feet deep. He would put as many as 3 women in the pit, and then he would fill the pit up with water. And as the women are shackled with these metal clamps on their ankles and on their wrists, he would get an electric wire as they're standing in water, and he would torture them by shocking them.
When The Silence of the Lambs was released in 1988, readers were transported by its unprecedented explorations of the homicidal mind. But one woman's love for the book stemmed from a different aspect, her admiration for its heroine.
She is much more of a cerebral hero than an action hero, which is you know, it's true to who women are. She's never gonna vanquish the enemy by her brawn, you know, and by her armor and swords. It's gonna have to be through her mind and through her compassion. Well, I love this idea, and this is, you know, was a real personal thing for me, this idea of somebody whose lot in life and whose destiny is to be not the victim, but the one who saves the victims. I have to admit, I did a lot of movies where I played, you know, victims of violence, but I think I was ready to, you know, play something else.
The part of Clarice Starling seemed perfect.
I think when you see something and you know that it's right for you for all sorts of reasons, not just because it's a good script or because you think that it's going to be very popular, but because it sort of confirms some psychological journey that you're on, you know, and you know that you need this in order to complete your life in some way, then I think you'll do almost anything to do it.
Foster wanted to buy the rights to the book, but was disappointed to find they had already been sold for $500,000. She wasn't the only star in Hollywood who sensed the novel's potential.
I loved the book. Silence of the Lambs was very different. We've seen some of those pieces of some of those characters in a number of film portrayals, but nothing quite like that. And I thought that if one could pull that off, that you had a chance of having a very successful film.
Gene Hackman actually came in with us as partners originally. He was going to direct it. It was going to be his first directing movie, and he was going to produce it and star in it. He was going to play Hannibal Lecter. And when the script was finished, he read it and said, "Boy, this is too violent for me. I don't think I can do it."
It was too violent. It was a number of things, and so it was a peculiar time for me that I had this project that I really wanted to do and wanted to be involved in. And it would have been too much for me.
And so we bought it back from him, and that's when I sent it to Jonathan Demme. You know, I'd remembered Jonathan's work, and I thought that he could do a really good thriller.
In 1988, few in Hollywood would have agreed with that statement.
Jonathan Demme had really been known for these kind of slapstick comedies. There was a real campiness to Jonathan.
The director had a cult following, but his offbeat films barely broke even at the box office. That didn't bother Orion Studios. Famous for supporting independent filmmakers like Woody Allen, they were willing to choose art over commerce.
You know, I always thought that what you needed to do is to allow somebody to reach their potential through developing their art on their own. And this is an art form. It's, you know, it's not just a business.
Still, Medavoy wasn't averse to a commercial breakthrough for Demme and thought Silence of the Lambs might be it. But the director was appalled at the idea.
He read a treatment of the book, an outline of the book, and like threw it against the wall, you know, in disgust, and said, "I'm not going to do a slasher movie." You know, I think his initial reaction was to not even really take in what it was. But when Mike called him up and said, "Listen, read this book," and he actually read it, he began to get very excited about the possibilities here.
The characters and storyline in the book inspired Demme, as did the script by Ted Talley. A playwright turned screenwriter, Talley's vision of the piece set the groundwork for everything that followed.
The most important decision was to concentrate on Clarice's point of view, to the exclusion of almost all others.
That meant major elements of the book would have to be eliminated. In particular, the motivations of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer, would be largely unexplored.
We ended up having to lose references to his childhood and how he came to be this twisted creature that he is. And it was unfortunate. He becomes something of a cipher in the movie, not as rich as he is in the book. But, you know, it's a 375-page book. You can't save everything. You've got to be tough about what comes and what goes.
With the bulk of the script ready, Demme's next task was to find his leading lady. He was hoping to look no further than the star of his last film, Married to the Mob.
The first actress that we went to was Michelle Pfeiffer, who also felt it was too dark. I mean, as much as she loved Jonathan, she couldn't see herself playing that part.
Meanwhile, Jodie Foster couldn't bear the thought of not playing it. The Oscar-winning actress rushed to tell Demme her feelings in person.
I basically flew to New York and just to tell him that I wanted to be his second choice because I was so passionate about it. So I did talk to him a little bit about my personal reasons and about my past a little bit. And, but then also that I really believed in the subtlety of it. And I thought that it was very important to maintain that kind of subtlety, is to keep her quiet and to keep her somebody who chooses her words very carefully and who really lives from the neck up.
Foster is an actress who enjoys universal respect and international fame, but back then she wasn't a big box office draw. That meant nothing to Demme. Overwhelmed by her conviction and insight, he gave her the part. Now, Demme had another casting decision upon which the success of the entire movie rested. Who would play the cunning cannibal Hannibal Lecter?
He could have chosen anyone in the world to play Lecter because it was such a juicy role.
The biggest names in Hollywood were bandied about. Robert De Niro, Robert Duvall, Dustin Hoffman. But Demme didn't want that kind of actor.
When you choose a great American method actor, you're choosing somebody who is willing to kind of vomit and, you know, blah, and have it all out there. And so you see the emotional trauma and you know psychologically that his father beat him and that he was abused and that it's all just coming out. But the British are different. And Lecter is different. Lecter is somebody who doesn't tell you who he is. He's somebody who's so busy toying with you because he's trying to deflect you ever knowing anything about him. And that if you ever get a glimmer of something inside of him, within 2 seconds he'll shut it down. And that's almost impossible to get an American actor to play that.
So the filmmaker found his Hannibal across the Atlantic. Anthony Hopkins was a Welsh actor with a long and brilliant career in England, but he had never managed to find a breakout role in the United States.
At the time that we cast Tony Hopkins, he was doing M. Butterfly in London and had pretty much, I think by his own admission, had pretty much given up the idea of being a big Hollywood movie star.
With the addition of Scott Glenn in the role of Starling's boss, Jack Crawford, Demme had now assembled the perfect team.
We had the exact right actors playing these parts, but not just that, we had them at the exact right moment of their careers for these parts to be perfect for them. A year before or a year later, it would not have been the same. They needed this movie and it needed them.
Demme thought he needed the input of Thomas Harris, but the reclusive author of LAMBS declined to be involved, simply wishing cast and crew good luck. Hollywood insiders weren't so generous, laughing at Orion for squandering its chance at a hit on an art house clique with little clout at the box office.
The ex-Marine firearms instructor chose to test Starling's hand strength in front of the class by seeing how many times she could pull the trigger on a Model 19 Smith & Wesson.
While Hopkins headed east, Jodie Foster had gone south to the FBI Academy in Virginia and took on the training of her character, Clarice Starling.
It was just an amazing experience. They took me on all of these obstacle courses and, did marksmanship stuff and a lot of classes about fingerprinting and the psychology, psychological profiling.
For Foster, the greatest challenge was physical.
I wasn't in as good a shape as they were, and I'm much shorter than everybody. So they have these kind of marine obstacles that are made for 6-foot-tall guys, and I'm, 5'3".
You spook easily, Starling?
Not yet, sir.
Actor Scott Glenn didn't spook easily either, but he'd be forever haunted by the things he learned at Quantico from John Douglas, his model for FBI man Jack Crawford.
After I'd been there for a few days, I said, thank you for letting me become part of your world. And he said, you're not really a part of my world. He said, you want to really become a part of my world? And I said, sure.
Douglas played the actor tapes made by Bedecker and Norris, two serial killers who recorded the anguished cries of the teenage girls they tortured.
And I have all the tapes of the killings, because what they would do is they'd get the victim in the back of the van, and as one guy is driving, the other one would be torturing them, beating their flesh, squeezing their flesh with pliers with an audio tape recorder on at the same time.
So I listened to some tapes and I put them away, and then I unlocked the door and I walked down the hall, and Douglas was standing on the hall, and I had to fight I just wanted to drop him on the spot. He said, now you're part of my world.
While the actors came to grips with the grisly work of the behavioral science unit, Jonathan Demme had begun to map out the filming. One of his early choices was to shoot at the FBI Academy itself.
And at first, when we visited the FBI, I couldn't believe how boring it looked. And I said to him, Jonathan, we can't shoot here. I said, this place has no character whatsoever. I mean, it's just a blank slate. It's awful. And he said, that's exactly what I want.
Demme also wanted the entire film to have the tense and mysterious feel Thomas Harris conveyed in his writing. To achieve that atmosphere visually, he gambled upon a risky tactic: repeated close-ups.
When you establish that the characters talk directly to the camera when they're talking to another person, that little by little the audience starts to not notice anymore. But it becomes very disconcerting because they're having these very intense discussions to the eyes of the audience.
What does this guy do? He covets. How do we first start to covet? We covet what we see every day.
It's almost frighteningly intimate, It's like the person's kind of talking into your skull, and yet it's off-putting, and that's a good combination, intimate and off-putting.
Demme knew what he wanted to do. Now all he needed was a space to do it in. He found it in Pittsburgh, where set construction began in December 1989 at an abandoned warehouse. To build their sets, the crew used blueprints drawn in the mind of author Thomas Harris many years before.
The levels of the floor vary from room to room by as much as a foot. There are thresholds to step over, lintels to duck.
Whenever we had a question about something, we would go to the book, and sure enough, there'd be a passage in there that described some aspect of what it was that we were challenged by, to the point where we could say, well, look, here it is. It's in black and white right here. Walker.
Thomas Harris created his macabre world alone, but making his nightmare real took a small army. When screenwriter Ted Talley came upon the troops finishing their work that winter of 1990, he was overwhelmed.
It was the most exciting feeling. It was like Oz was on the horizon.
It was December 1989 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There, filmmaker Jonathan Demme, known until now for his offbeat comedies, would attempt to turn the horrific vision of author Thomas Harris into a successful movie. At first, he shot darkly comic scenes that didn't sit well with his lead actress.
I was worried that he wasn't going to treat the film with enough dignity and respect. And on the first few days of shooting, there were all these little jokes. You'd see Clarice running and they'd be talking about something important, and then you'd pan over and you'd see like a bunch of guys' butts, I thought, my teeth were gritting. I was like, You know, and I was just very worried that somehow the tone of the comedic black humor tone was going to find itself in this film.
Over the next few weeks, Demi proved her fears unfounded.
The good news is he cut it all out. And I think he was finding his voice, and I think that most directors do this, where the first 2 or 3 weeks, they always include in the process of the movie making things that they're comfortable with that they've done in the past, and then they can have a choice later on to cut that out.
In the end, Demi was Foster's kind of director through and through.
He's somebody who abhors violence, who would never consider making a movie that was violent. This isn't a genre that he's ever considered working in. He's the kind of guy who identifies with the woman in the movie. He's really what we look at as the quintessential female director. That's Jonathan Demme. And he, of course, is like the last person you would ever hire to do Silence of the Lambs, and that's why he's so perfect for it.
For the first 10 minutes of the film, the brilliant psychiatrist turned cannibal is talked about, never seen. Demme builds the tension as agent in training Clarice Starling is sent by the FBI to interview the imprisoned killer. Warned to exercise extreme caution in dealing with the deadly genius, she descends to the cell where he's kept.
Do not touch the glass. Do not approach the glass. You pass him nothing but soft paper. No pencils or pens.
Don't go near the glass. Don't touch the glass.
She's led down to where he is.
She's actually descending into hell. She keeps going further and further down into the basement.
This descent, it was always heading down.
Into this dungeon-looking place.
The sound, there are all kinds of weird submarine sounds. The tension just escalates and escalates. It's building and building and building, and then you deliver to Hannibal Lecter.
And he's calm.
Good morning.
The cell holding this monster was based on the description of Thomas Harris at first.
The front is a wall of bars, but within the bars, at a distance greater than the human reach, is a second barrier, a stout nylon net stretched from floor to ceiling.
Tom Harris is exhaustive in his research when he writes his books, and so we used the book as a primer for making the movie. And for us, it was always, what was Tom's choice, and we'd try to honor that unless there was some great reason for going in another direction.
In this case, there was.
In the book, it's written that Lecter's cell is barred, and then it has sort of mesh netting in addition to that, to show that, you know, he's so dangerous that you can't even let him get near the bars.
Jonathan started to become very concerned about how we were going to see Lecter if we were just going to be constantly looking through bars at him. And if he got on the other side of the bars, he was concerned that the viewer would then feel that he wasn't dangerous enough. We tested every kind of thickness of bar imaginable. This way, this way, this way, you know, 2 inches thick, 1.5 inches thick, inch thick, you know, it just went on, at which point I said, why don't we do like they do now in banks and bodegas? Let's just use plexiglass.
And then the next problem appeared. The actors can barely hear each other.
At which point I said, well, let's do like they do in taxis where they drill holes, you know, and that way they can speak to each other.
Having the plexi there let Jonathan dissolve the distance between them when he wanted to, or suggest the safety of it when he needed that. And it also gave you that incredible moment where Lecter's face is reflected in the glass next to hers.
And then Hopkins used it. He could smell, you know, things through it. He so got it, and he used it. He used everything that we gave him. He loved being Lecter.
Sometimes, Hopkins' relish for the role confounded his co-star. The words were lifted straight from the dialogue of Thomas Harris, but the way Hopkins delivered them was thoroughly his own. At first, Foster was taken aback.
Oh, Agent Starling, you think you can dissect me with this blunt little tool?
And he started imitating my accent, and I felt this just flush go up of feeling totally humiliated and completely angry at him as an actor, you know, because, come on, he was imitating my accent. He was making fun of my accent, but that also kind of carried on to the character of somebody who, you know, was sitting there like a piñata, letting themselves be completely berated and having their past taken down. and dissect it in front of them.
You know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube. A well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Good nutrition's giving you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling?
Playing strength and vulnerability at the same time, you know? I think it's very tricky, because you don't want to see an actor act afraid. You want to see them try and overcome their fear.
While you could only dream of getting out, getting anywhere, getting all the way to the FBI.
You see a lot, Doctor?
What I found as an actor is that very often the thing that's the most moving to you in a film is not so much your soliloquy or your big scene or your monologue, but is something that you react to and something that somebody says to you or does to you, or that's where you find yourself sitting in a chair and being completely aghast about it. And those are the things that kind of ran through my head about Clarice.
The scene's culminating lines were taken almost directly from the book, but the sound that punctuates them was made up on the spot. Another improv from Hopkins.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Anthony Hopkins was on screen for only 7 minutes in that first scene, but the impact he made would be felt by audiences for years to come.
He had just plugged into something on a deep psychological level, you know, it was horrifying. I still think there hasn't been anything that scary since.
Thank you, Barney.
In January 1990, Anthony Hopkins' perfect embodiment of Hannibal the Cannibal sent chills through cast and crew on the Silence of the Lambs set.
I was kind of scared to death of him. I didn't really expect it, and he had that voice, and he just kind of scared me.
But when their scenes were done, the actors discovered the man behind the mask.
I can't even imagine where he pulled that character from. He's like sweet, unassuming, you know, friendly guy.
It was just a joy working with him. And we worked so well together. Both of us come from that school of we don't really talk about what we're going to do. We just drink some coffees and talk about, you know, wine and opera and, you know, other stuff. And then somebody says action, and then we just do it. And that all of the intensity happens on screen.
The funny thing was, if you came and visited the set of The Silence of the Lambs, you would have thought that we were all making a comedy. Not because we took serial murder lightly or any of that, but it was both necessary to keep your spirits up if you were shooting autopsy scenes and all kinds of gruesome stuff, and because that was just the nature of the leader on this set. You know, the director is an upbeat, happy guy, and that was contagious.
Demi's friendly demeanor didn't mean he wasn't aggressive about realizing his vision.
I would worry all the time that we were cutting too much, that this is hard for an audience to follow, especially in a movie where it's going by them one time quickly. It's not a book where you can say, wait a minute, flip back to the previous chapter and see how that was set up or what that meant. So I said, Jonathan, you know, we're going to lose them. They're going to be confused. And Jonathan said, well, you know, better to confuse them for 5 minutes than to bore them for 5 seconds.
Never boring was the relationship between Lecter and Starling, even though they only have 4 scenes together. In their last meeting, Clarice begs Hannibal to help her catch Buffalo Bill, who's hours from killing Catherine Martin, the woman he's kidnapped. Longing to taste her pain, Lecter refuses to help Clarice until she reveals the most intimate secret of her rural childhood.
It's Clarice's worst moment, so now she has to beg. And now she'll have to give up something much more precious than what she's had to give up before.
What did you see, Clarice? What did you see?
Lambs. They were screaming.
They were slaughtering the spring lambs?
They were screaming.
And you think if you save poor Catherine, you could make them stop, don't you? You think if Catherine lives, you won't wake up in the dark ever again to that awful screaming of the lambs?
I don't know. I don't know.
Thank you, Clarice. Thank you.
he forces her to go back and remember that traumatic experience, and then he kind of savors it and rolls his eyes in the film and says, "Thank you, Clarice." And you get the deep satisfaction that he's tasted someone's humanity, almost devoured it.
With the scene's completion, there was only one matter left to attend to.
If you're going to have a movie that's a classic, it's got to have a classic ending.
In the book, Lecter escapes from prison and sends a threatening letter to Dr. Frederick Chilton, director of the institution where he was imprisoned. That ending wasn't compelling enough for a film. Tally and Demi thought about ways to give Lecter a chance at nabbing Dr. Chilton in the flesh.
He said, boy, if Chilton had fled to a tropical island, we'd all have to go to that tropical island on expense account to shoot that scene. I said, he's going to go to a tropical island.
That sense of Chilton walking down this road with this cannibal in a white suit and a white hat sauntering after him. That's one of the great endings in cinema history.
That's in retrospect. When filming ended in March 1990, Anthony Heald wasn't thinking in such lofty terms.
I had no sense at all that I had participated in something that people would be doing documentaries about 10 years later.
The movie was supposed to come out in the fall, but Orion Studios bumped the release date to promote a film with far more obvious Oscar promise, Dances with Wolves.
And instead of opening prestigiously in September or October in awards season, we're going to open you in February when, things are kind of slow and movies tend to get forgotten.
I thought, oh man, they're burying it. They're burying it. They know it's a stinker.
With no big box office stars and a director whose films barely squeaked out a profit, industry expectations weren't high for The Silence of the Lambs.
We didn't have the major honkin' movie stars. Our previous two pictures hadn't gone through the roof. There wasn't a reason to think, there it is, the next big thing.
Until people saw the film. When they did, almost everyone agreed Orion had a huge hit on its hands.
At the box office last weekend, for the third time, The Silence of the Lambs stayed on top.
Lambs stayed at #1 for 5 weeks, raking in nearly $300 million worldwide. But not everyone was happy with the film. The protests centered on the characterization of serial killer Buffalo Bill. With his feminine clothing and poodle named Precious, many gay men perceived him as a damaging stereotype in an era without positive gay role models.
In thinking back on what we had done, I could understand why they might be upset about it.
In Harris's book, Bill's pathology is more developed, making it clear the killer is sexually confused, not necessarily gay. But the movie had lost some of those subtleties.
And we certainly wished that we had not stepped on those toes and that we had crafted that character in some different way. At least, God forbid, not giving him a white, poodle that he calls Precious.
At first, there were concerns the protests might hurt the film come Oscar time. But then again, what chance did a suspense movie featuring a flesh-eating serial killer have at the Academy Awards anyway? The Silence of the Lambs swept the Oscars like no movie in almost 20 years, winning Best Picture, Director, Actor, Actress, and Screenplay.
And there we all were, sweating and giddy and hooping and hollering.
It was amazing. I screamed myself hoarse. I screamed. I could not believe it. It's going to go down in history. It's one of the greatest psychological thriller horror films ever.
The makers of the movie weren't alone. Thomas Harris, the reclusive author, joined in the revelry by sending each of the victorious filmmakers a case of wine. Today, The Silence of the Lambs demonstrates staying true to an author's vision, even if it departs from Hollywood formula, doesn't have to mean disaster. Lambs has a female hero, no sex, and a cannibal as its leading man. In retrospect, who would have it any other way?
I just think we were all really inspired by Thomas Harris's writing. I think that, Silence was just was just an amazing novel. And it's one of those things that happens to somebody once in their life. I'm very proud of it. Very proud of it.
It's hard to imagine that during the making of The Silence of the Lambs, some Hollywood executives were sure Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins didn't have the box office clout to make it a hit. Well, nobody's perfect. I'm Peter Gallagher. See you next time on Page to Screen.